Copenhagen, there's been a lot of debate as to what could be achieved there, what possibly might be achieved. What do you think the possible outcomes could be in Copenhagen?
Okay, so the question there was, we didn't hear, there's been a lot of discussion in the media and across the board on what the outcomes of Copenhagen will be. The question is, what do the panel members think the outcomes of Copenhagen will be? And we'll start with Deirdre, ladies first.
Right, well, I think the outcomes depend very much on who's going to be there. And at the moment, it isn't clear exactly who is going to be there. The important country that really needs to be there is America. And I still haven't found confirmation that Obama is going to be there. In fact, we're looking into it. The only person I could find that was confirmed was Gordon Brown. So I think the important thing is to get the people around the table first.
Okay, you mentioned America there. Scott, what are your thoughts on that?
I guess the starting point is to realize how far we moved backwards. I mean, the fact is that it's now a decade since Kyoto. And that, although not every country was signed up to Kyoto, and quite infamously, the United States never joined it, at least you had that opening there, that the issue was being talked about. And in a sense, we spent a decade trying to get political traction and to get people back around the table. To the extent that you at least did that much, and let the Americans show up, and that, for example, the Chinese and the Indians come to the table with their issues, which are quite important, quite big. But also the fact that other countries have the feeling they have the space to raise their concerns. It's a start, and it's a start for two reasons. One is, at least the seriousness of the issue is being recognized again, and is being placed above national politics. But two, and I think Roger made the point quite well, this is not just a climate change or global warming issue anymore. This is a resource issue as well. Questions about water and food distribution, questions about the balance between technology and clean living, all have to be introduced. So if I was going to have my half-empty glass in front of me, I wouldn't expect dramatic advances out of Copenhagen, but looking at it half full, it's a start. The question then is, 6 months, 12 months down the line, are we able to advance on that?
Okay, thanks, Rick. Ian, if we come to you.
I think what Scott said is absolutely right about resources, and the implication of that actually is there isn't a problem with countries going it alone. If we insulate our buildings far better, we're saving fossil fuels, which is good for us and for the climate. So it shouldn't be everything against for everybody else. In terms of what could be achieved, there could be a percentage for industrialised nations to commit to cutting by 2020. It won't be enough, but if it's something, at least it's there on the table. There may be some help, again not enough money, for poor countries to develop without being carbon intensive. That would be great. The thing I would like to see up in is the actual debate of what mechanism and model that is fair. If I have a chance, I'll talk about contraction and convergence on that. And again, what sort of society are we trying to produce? To me, those are big issues that need to be tackled really before we can have a proper agreement.
Okay. Ralph, what are your thoughts on this deal? Does there even need to be a deal coming from Copenhagen?
Well, I've got a list here of 10 things which I believe are far more important than the current man-made global warming debate. And this particular point about particularly water for poor nations is right at the top of my list, and I think things of that type are more important. I won't go through all this because it will take a long time.
Well, can I just ask you to stick to the question just for right now? So in terms of Copenhagen, what do you see the outcomes, and what does the deal need to come out of Copenhagen?
Nothing that will affect the world at all.
Okay, we'll come back to that. We've got a few questions on that. Okay, Roger, can I give
I don't think we should expect too much out of Copenhagen. I think it is, unfortunately, it's the start of a process. And what we need to do is actually get a shared vision of where the world needs to be by 2050. And I think that includes convergence on the amount of carbon each human being on this planet can realistically use, for example. And it's quite right that we can all do our individual bit as countries down that route. We do need agreement as well on mechanisms. So I hope that it's the start of a positive process. I wish that it would actually done a real substantive deal.
Okay, I see a hand at the top there, gentleman green t-shirt.
Does the panel accept that the continuing expansion of the automobile industry is totally unsustainable? For that matter as well, aviation, but I'll stick to automobiles for the moment. And that therefore we need to move very quickly to a system of free public transport that has already been pioneered in Hasselt in Germany and Belgium, Newcastle in Australia, and Zagreb. Is it high time we in Birmingham, in this country, move to a system of free, planned public transport?
Is that addressed to any particular panel member?
Not particularly.
Okay, Scott, being an American yourself, I'm sure you've got big thoughts on.
Well, I won't go with America though, because I'll go with Britain when I was here in the 1980s, and I find it ironic that 25 years after we were talking about Red Ken and the subsidized buses in London, or the Socialist Republic of Sheffield, that we come back to this possibility. And that is that you're quite right. I mean, the fact is that there has been, and I will talk about this quite often, the notion of the free rider principle. And the free rider principle, as it is operated in the United States, is that you could run private transport because the country was so big and because petrol was so cheap, and you could throw up all the chemicals you wanted to in the air and you wouldn't pay the full cost of it. Unless we recognize that there has to be effectively a taxation, an extra cost to cover what we basically damage the environment using private transport, that problem is going to continue. The flip side, however, which you talk about in public transport, I hesitate to say is even harder, because you're introducing this question at a time of recession, and what is likely to be a long recession, and when councils are facing demands on their budgets, and basically offering the principle of free private transport is something or public transport is something I accept. In practical terms, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to see how we're going to get to that in the near future.
Okay, Deirdre, being a councillor on Birmingham City Council, you mentioned the question, but
Yes,
what's Birmingham doing?
Yeah, no, I agree with what you say. I mean, it's a brilliant idea, but we work to a finite budget, and funding such a thing, particularly in the current economic situation, would be very difficult. You mentioned the automobile industry, and I presume you mean cars that take petrol mainly, but in fact we could look at other things as we are looking at, such as electric cars. So it's maybe possible to go down that route as well. I think the problem, obviously, if you had a really good transport system, you would encourage people onto it. But one of the problems that we're all used to using cars is that we're used to going from exactly where we want to go to exactly where we want to go. And no matter how good the public transport system is, and if it's free, and if it's clean, and if it's safe, it still mostly won't provide that. And so getting people to accept it, because in some ways it won't be such a good service as they've been used to, is also a difficult thing. But while we're talking about cars, there's just one other thing I wanted to say. Yes, we don't want to waste, we want to be burning carbon that we don't want to need, we don't want to be making journeys that we don't need to. But one thing that really annoyed me in the last few months was when they had the Grand Prix, I think it was in Singapore, and they had it at night. And the lights that must have been used to run that car race at night, because obviously if you're going at those speeds, it's got to be fairly light, I thought was the most horrendous waste of energy. And that's the kind of thing that we ought to be looking at perhaps, rather than actually cutting down on somebody who needs to make a journey to go to work.
Okay, Ian, if I can present to you, we talked about how we work with finite budgets, but arguably money shouldn't be an equation when it comes to the end of the world, perhaps?
To answer your question, reduce the amount of cars, definitely yes. To make them some renewable source, possibly yes. That's a difficult question. Public transport in places like London and Birmingham, definitely a good idea. I haven't had the pleasure of going as far as the places you've mentioned. I have been to Amsterdam though, which is roughly a third on bikes, a third by public transport and a third by cars. That seems to be a reasonable model to aim for. But I would say I'm not all in favour of public transport, because people who have high-speed rail links everywhere, I suppose flights everywhere, and these are just as damaging to the environment as car travel. So what we need to do is reduce the desire and need to travel. That means organise its town planning, really boring and nerdy, but getting your shops and work and houses close together so you don't need to travel is far better. The easy example of out-of-town superstores are not a good idea. They encourage people to drive and